War is the lifeblood of the imperium of man. Across the vast expanse of the galaxy, countless conflicts rage, from skirmishes in the void to planet-spanning wars that last for generations. Yet, few battles in the 41st millennium stand out as truly legendary, remembered for their sheer brutality, scale, and horror. Among them, the Siege of Vraks is a name spoken with equal parts, dread and reverence, a war of attrition so devastating that it reshaped not only the world it consumed, but also the warriors who fought upon its blood-soaked soil. Vraks itself was unremarkable, a barren, windswept planet in the Segmentum Obscurus, long thought to be of little strategic importance beyond its role as a storehouse of munitions and war materiel. It was a place where the Imperium hoarded weapons and armor for the eternal wars to come. Its isolation made it an ideal location for such a stockpile, and so for centuries it remained nothing more than a footnote in the vast annals of the Imperium's logistical records. That changed when rebellion erupted. It is an all-too-common story in the Imperium. A world falls into heresy, whether by the slow corruption of chaos or the bitterness of those who feel abandoned by the distant rulers of Terra. On Vraks, it began with a single man, a figure who would lead a planet-wide revolt, transforming a once loyal imperial bastion into a fortress of the damned. His defiance would bring forth one of the longest and bloodiest sieges in imperial history, a war measured not in years, but in decades. To crush this uprising, the Imperium sent one of its most feared forces, the Death Corps of Krieg. Renowned for their ruthless discipline and willingness to wage total war, they descended upon Vraks with one mission: to reclaim the planet no matter the cost. Yet what was meant to be a swift operation soon devolved into a quagmire of endless bloodshed, where the line between victory and defeat blurred under the weight of ceaseless slaughter. The Siege of Vraks was not a conventional war. It was a meat grinder, where attrition became the only strategy, and bodies were the currency of battle. It was a test of endurance, of unyielding will against insurmountable opposition. Trenches carved into toxic wastelands, bombardments that lasted for years, and the slow, merciless grind of trench warfare, all of these would define the struggle that followed. Yet, Vraks was not only a battlefield of men and machines. Darker forces stirred beneath its surface. As the siege dragged on, the war would evolve beyond mere rebellion, plunging into the abyss of chaos itself. What began as a campaign to crush a defector's insurrection soon became something far worse, a desperate struggle against horrors beyond comprehension. This is the story of the Siege of Vraks, a war that began as a purge and ended as a nightmare, a war that cost untold millions of lives and left a planet forever scarred, a war that revealed the true cost of unrelenting conflict in the grim darkness of the far future. And so, as the guns of Krieg fell silent, as the last defenders of Vraks were either slain or consumed by the void, the question remained: was it worth the price? At the heart of the siege stood two forces locked in an unrelenting struggle, one bound by duty, the other by defiance. Each side brought its own strengths, weaknesses, and purpose to the conflict, shaping the brutal war that unfolded across the planet. The defenders of Vraks were a mixture of traitors, outcasts, and those who had turned against the Imperium. At the center of their rebellion was the apostate cardinal, the man whose actions set the planet on a path to destruction. His authority was absolute among his followers, a symbol of defiance against the distant masters of the Imperium. Around him gathered a militia of former Imperial servants, planetary defense forces, and those who saw an opportunity to rise against the Imperium's rule. They fortified themselves within the labyrinthine defenses of the planet's fortress structures, prepared to resist any force that sought to reclaim what they now considered their own. Beyond mere human insurrectionists, darker forces lurked within the rebellion's ranks. The initial uprising attracted the attention of war bands that had long abandoned their oaths to the Emperor, eager to lend their strength to a war that promised slaughter and destruction. Among these were warriors clad in the twisted remnants of their once proud armor, drawn by the scent of conflict and the lure of what Vraks could offer. Some fought for personal gain, others for the favor of their new masters, but all sought only one thing: war without end. Standing against them was one of the Imperium's most unyielding military forces. The task of reclaiming Vraks was assigned to the Death Corps of Krieg, a force shaped by war and defined by sacrifice. Clad in their signature greatcoats and rebreathers, they embodied the Imperium's brutal doctrine of attrition. Unlike conventional regiments, they did not rely on morale or camaraderie to sustain them. They advanced without hesitation, undeterred by casualties, for they saw themselves as already dead the moment they took up arms. Their tactics were drawn from the grim lessons of their own homeworld, where total destruction had been the price of redemption. While the Death Corps formed the backbone of the campaign, they were not the only Imperial forces to take part. As the siege dragged on, it became clear that brute force alone would not be enough to overcome the enemy's defenses. Specialized regiments were brought in to support the war effort, each adding their own expertise to the ever-escalating battle. Some were siege masters, skilled in breaking even the most entrenched fortifications. Others brought advanced weaponry designed to crush the resistance that seemed impossible to dislodge. With every passing year, more soldiers were thrown into the grinder, reinforcing an operation that refused to end. Beyond conventional military forces, another presence loomed over the battlefield. The Imperium does not tolerate rebellion, and where war alone is not enough, other measures are taken. Those who deal in judgment and extermination arrived to ensure that Vraks' fall would not go unanswered. Their authority was unquestioned, and their methods were absolute. They cared little for the cost in lives, only for the certainty of victory, regardless of what means were necessary to achieve it. As the years passed and the war consumed more and more of the Imperium's resources, others took notice. The drawn-out conflict became a beacon for those who thrive on prolonged bloodshed. From distant war zones, battle-hardened veterans arrived, seeking to carve their own mark on the war-torn landscape. Some came out of duty, others out of necessity, but all played their part in fueling the endless cycle of destruction. With every new force that entered the fray, the battle for Vraks became more than just a siege. It was a conflict of ideologies, of loyalty against defiance, of survival against annihilation. Each faction had its role to play, each force had its purpose, and none would emerge from the war unchanged. Vraks had long been a quiet world, its significance lying not in its landscapes or people, but in its function. Situated far from the front lines of any major conflict, it was a logistical hub, a storage facility where the Imperium stockpiled war materiel for future campaigns. Vaults beneath its surface housed enough weapons, armor, and ammunition to supply entire crusades, ensuring that wherever the Imperium waged war, it would never lack the tools to do so. Though heavily fortified, it was not a battlefield, at least not yet. The governance of Vraks was entrusted to a small but highly structured hierarchy. At the top stood its overseers, individuals chosen for their ability to maintain order and efficiency rather than for martial prowess. These administrators managed the planet's vast warehouses and coordinated shipments to Imperial warfronts. Defense was considered secondary to logistics. The planetary garrison consisted mostly of security forces rather than a standing army, with its primary role being to deter sabotage, piracy, or small-scale insurrections. Larger threats were never considered a realistic concern. If war ever reached Vraks, it would mean that something had already gone terribly wrong. Its remoteness, however, was both its strength and its weakness. The same isolation that made it ideal for storing weapons also made it vulnerable to internal instability. Authority on Vraks was centralized, and the planetary governor held absolute power over its operations. This allowed for strict control, but it also meant that if corruption took root at the highest levels, there would be no one to challenge it. Without external oversight, All decisions rested in the hands of a few individuals whose word could shape the future of the entire planet. Tensions first began to rise when faith was placed above duty. Across the Imperium, religious fervor was both a source of strength and a potential risk. While devotion to the Emperor was a necessity, it was not always aligned with the demands of imperial bureaucracy. On Vraks, a shift occurred as authority was granted to those who wielded spiritual influence rather than administrative expertise. Over time, the balance of power tilted, and the priorities of the planet's leadership changed. Logistics and security were no longer the sole concerns. Faith became the foundation of rule. With faith came division. While many accepted this new order without question, others saw it as a distraction from Vraks' true purpose. Dissent simmered beneath the surface, whispered among those who still believed in the old ways of governance. Yet there was no open conflict, at least not at first. Those who disagreed were removed from their positions, reassigned, or quietly silenced. The planet's rulers ensured that no opposition could gain traction, eliminating any challenge before it could become a real threat. For a time, it seemed that stability would hold. But unseen forces thrive in isolation, and where power is absolute, corruption is never far behind. The changes on Vraks did not go unnoticed by those outside its borders. Eyes that had long watched for weakness saw an opportunity, and whispers of rebellion began to spread. Communications with higher authorities were controlled, ensuring that only select messages left the planet. By the time warning signs reached those who could intervene, the situation had already spiraled beyond control. It was not a sudden uprising, nor a single moment of defiance, but a slow unraveling of order. As control tightened, resistance grew. Those who had once followed without question now hesitated, and hesitation bred doubt. Doubt turned to resentment, and resentment became something far more dangerous. It was a collapse that could not be stopped, not by command, nor by decree. The foundations had been cracked, and soon they would crumble entirely. What followed was inevitable. The chain of authority that bound Vraks to the Imperium was severed, and in its place rose something new. The world that had once existed as a stockpile for war was about to become a battleground, its vast caches of weapons turned against those who had once stored them. The siege that would follow was not the product of a single decision, but the result of years of unchecked power, faith without restraint, and the slow corruption that had taken hold in the shadows. The first engagement on Vraks was not an open battlefield clash, but a slow descent into war. What had started as an internal crisis had now escalated beyond containment. Orders were issued to reclaim the planet, but a direct assault was never the Imperium's first choice. The sheer scale of the munitions stored on Vraks meant that reckless action could lead to catastrophic losses. Instead, the initial approach was calculated, a siege, one that would isolate the planet and strangle resistance over time. The first step was encirclement. The Imperium's fleets moved into position, cutting off all outbound communication and halting any attempt to flee. The rebels had fortified themselves within the world's network of defenses, but without resupply, their survival was limited to what could be scavenged or manufactured on Vraks itself. Initial reports suggested that the war would not last long. Without external support, the defenders were expected to collapse under the weight of attrition. But expectations were wrong. The reality of Vraks' defenses quickly became apparent. The fortifications that once safeguarded the Imperium's stockpiles now worked against those trying to reclaim them. Vast networks of bunkers, trenches, and fortified positions crisscrossed the landscape, forming a near-impenetrable web of strongpoints. The defenders had access to years' worth of supplies, enough to sustain them far longer than Imperial command had anticipated. What was meant to be a swift campaign became something far worse, a drawn-out war of exhaustion. With retreat not an option, the siege began in earnest. The first major offensives were focused on breaching the outer defenses. Artillery bombardments pounded enemy positions, while infantry regiments advanced under heavy fire. Progress was slow, measured in meters rather than kilometers. Each trench line taken was another that had to be reinforced before the enemy counterattacked. The defenders had turned every inch of Vraks into a death trap, forcing the attackers to pay for every advance in blood. Years passed and the war evolved. The early battles had been conventional: infantry charges, mechanized assaults, and artillery duels. But as the siege ground on, new tactics were introduced. The Imperium deployed more specialized forces, bringing in fresh regiments trained in siege warfare. Massive earthworks were constructed to undermine enemy defenses, while tunnel networks were collapsed to deny the defenders any advantage. Still, the war did not end. As the siege progressed, desperation took hold. The defenders, once fighting to hold their positions, now launched their own counteroffensives, attempting to break the encirclement. The battlefronts shifted, trenches were lost and retaken, and the casualty count continued to rise. The planet itself began to change. What had once been a functional world was now a wasteland of craters, collapsed structures, and unending fields of unburied dead. Toxic clouds of chemical agents mixed with the atmosphere, rendering entire sectors uninhabitable. The landscape itself became a weapon, shaping the course of battle as much as any strategy or command. The final years of the siege saw its deadliest fighting. With both sides exhausted, the war entered its most brutal phase. Entire regiments vanished in the night as new horrors emerged from the depths of the planet's fortifications. The conflict had attracted attention far beyond the Imperium's reach, and where war lingers, other forces take notice. The defenders, once fighting for survival, now fought for something else entirely, their actions driven by something darker than mere defiance. The last battles of Vraks were fought not for victory, but for annihilation. The defenders had no intention of surrendering, and the Imperium had no choice but to finish what it had started. The war that had begun as an attempt to reclaim a lost world had now become something more, a statement, a warning, and a lesson written in fire and ash. The siege had lasted far longer than anyone had predicted, but as the final offensives were prepared, one truth remained. Vraks would burn. The siege had already dragged on far longer than expected, and despite the Imperium's relentless assaults, the defenders of Vraks refused to collapse. Every gain was met with equally devastating losses, every advance countered by a brutal counteroffensive. The war had become a deadlock, a conflict where victory seemed as distant as the stars above. But wars are not won by attrition alone. Decisive action was needed, and when the moment arrived, it reshaped the battle entirely. The turning point of the siege did not come from a single battle, but from a decision made out of sheer necessity. The prolonged conflict had strained resources to the breaking point. The Imperium's original strategy, an overwhelming siege campaign conducted by standard military regiments, had failed to deliver the swift victory that had been promised. The defenders were too deeply entrenched, the fortifications too resilient, and the conditions too brutal for conventional warfare to achieve the decisive breakthrough that was needed. Recognizing that standard measures were insufficient, the Imperium escalated the war beyond what had been previously deemed acceptable. The order was given to deploy forces that would not only break the deadlock, but crush the defenders with absolute finality. No longer would the siege be fought with the expectation of reclaiming Vraks intact. The planet itself had become the battlefield, and in the eyes of Imperial command, it was now expendable. The decision to escalate was not made lightly. The war had already consumed an incalculable number of lives, and every attempt at negotiation or psychological warfare had been met with defiance. The defenders had no intention of surrendering, and the Imperium could not afford to continue its war of attrition indefinitely. It was no longer a matter of reclaiming lost ground. It was a matter of erasing the enemy entirely. And so, the order was given. Extermination. With this shift in strategy, new forces entered the battle, units that were never meant for prolonged sieges, but for swift and absolute destruction. The nature of the war changed overnight. What had once been a campaign to reclaim Vraks now became a war of obliteration. No longer would the attackers attempt to preserve infrastructure, munitions, or strong points. Everything was now a target, and every enemy position would be reduced to ruin. Tactics shifted accordingly. The relentless bombardments that had once been measured for precision were now unleashed with indiscriminate fury. Strategic targets became irrelevant. Everything within the enemy's defensive lines was marked for destruction. Specialized forces were deployed to bypass the endless trench networks, conducting deep strikes into the heart of the enemy's fortifications. The war that had once been fought in inches was now waged in firestorms. With no possibility of surrender, the defenders responded in kind. If they were to be destroyed, they would take as many of their enemies with them as possible. Their resistance became even more fanatical, their tactics more desperate. The battle lines blurred as the distinction between attack and defense vanished. Both sides now fought with the knowledge that this was the final stage of the war. The escalation reached its peak when direct intervention was authorized on a level never before seen in the campaign. What had begun as a war of attrition was now a war of annihilation, and from that moment on, the siege of Vraks was no longer a conflict to reclaim lost territory. It had become a purge, a war where survival was no longer the goal. There would be no rebuilding, no reclamation, only the final destruction of everything that remained. The end of the siege did not bring victory in the way the Imperium had envisioned. The planet had been reclaimed, but at a cost so immense that even the most hardened strategists hesitated to call it a success. Vraks was no longer a vital munitions world. It was a wasteland stripped of its former purpose, its surface reduced to an expanse of ruined fortifications, chemical-tainted soil, and endless graveyards of the fallen. The war had consumed an unthinkable number of lives. Entire regiments had been annihilated, their ranks ground into nothing by the relentless combat. The forces of the Imperium had suffered losses so severe that replacements struggled to keep up with demand. Those who had survived bore scars that ran deeper than flesh. Soldiers who had spent years in the toxic trenches of Vraks were never the same again. Even the most battle-hardened warriors found themselves changed, their faith tested by the scale of the suffering they had endured. The logistics of the war had drained vast amounts of resources from other fronts. The Imperium had diverted ships, weapons, and entire armies to retake a world that, in the end, had little left to offer. Other war zones, equally desperate for reinforcements, had been neglected as Vraks consumed everything sent its way. Some of these ignored conflicts ended in disaster, as enemies elsewhere seized the opportunity to strike, while Imperial forces remained locked in the attritional nightmare of the siege. Beyond its immediate military impact, the war on Vraks sent a message across the galaxy. To the Imperium's enemies, it was proof that even a well-fortified stronghold could be broken, but at a staggering cost. The conflict had exposed weaknesses in the Imperium's war machine, showing how easily it could become bogged down when faced with an enemy prepared to dig in and endure. Rebellions elsewhere began to adapt, taking lessons from Vraks, knowing that if they could stretch a conflict long enough, they could bleed the Imperium dry. Among the Imperium's own ranks, the war left an undeniable mark. The lessons learned from Vraks shaped future campaigns, reinforcing the necessity of overwhelming force and the dangers of prolonged sieges. The death toll had been unacceptable, and commanders who had once believed in patience now embraced more brutal methods to avoid another protracted disaster. Worlds deemed too resistant to imperial rule saw their destruction ordered rather than their reconquest attempted. Vraks had proven that some battles were too costly to wage. The aftermath of the siege also raised uncomfortable questions. The defenders had held out far longer than anyone had expected, and though they had ultimately been destroyed, their resilience unsettled many within the Imperium. How had they endured for so long? Who had supplied them with the means to resist? The war had begun as an insurrection, but by the end, it had transformed into something far more dangerous. The deeper implications of that transformation were something few wished to discuss, yet the scars left by the siege would ensure that its memory would not fade. The world itself was declared beyond salvation. Though technically reclaimed, it was of no further use to the Imperium. The toxic remains of the battlefield, the ruined infrastructure, and the sheer scale of devastation meant that rebuilding was impossible. Vraks was left to rot, abandoned as a warning to any who might consider following the same path. It had been retaken, but not restored. The war had left nothing behind worth saving. The siege of Vraks stands out in the history of warfare, not just for its sheer brutality, but for the methods used by both sides in their desperate struggle. The conflict showcased tactics and weaponry that defined it as one of the most infamous sieges in the galaxy. Among the many aspects that made Vraks unique, several continue to be discussed and analyzed by those who study the art of war in the grim darkness of the far future. One of the defining features of the siege was the sheer scale of trench warfare. Unlike many planetary conflicts, which are often dominated by fast-moving armored spearheads or orbital bombardments, the battle for Vraks resembled wars of attrition from a bygone era. The entire planet became a labyrinth of trenches, bunkers, and artillery emplacements. Every advance required methodical clearing of enemy strongpoints, only for new defenses to rise just as quickly. The depth and complexity of these fortifications forced the attackers into a grueling war of inches, making Vraks one of the deadliest battlegrounds in recorded history. Artillery played a devastating role on both sides, with bombardments reaching levels rarely seen in warfare. Entire sectors were reduced to craters before infantry even attempted to advance. The Imperium's reliance on heavy guns was met with equally relentless counter-barrages from the defenders, turning much of the battlefield into a no-man's land where survival was measured in seconds. The sheer amount of ordnance expended on Vraks was so immense that estimates suggest it rivaled entire crusades fought elsewhere. A topic that often sparks debate is the extensive use of chemical and incendiary weapons. The war had long since crossed the boundaries of conventional engagements, and as desperation mounted, both sides resorted to methods that would have been unthinkable in other conflicts. Gas attacks became commonplace, with entire regiments wiped out by lingering toxins that settled into the trenches. Firestorms created by incendiary barrages scoured vast areas of the battlefield, turning oxygen itself into fuel for destruction. The environmental impact of these weapons ensured that even after the siege ended, the planet remained inhospitable. Another aspect frequently discussed is the sheer number of siege engines deployed during the campaign. Vraks became a testing ground for some of the most devastating war machines the Imperium could field. Super heavy tanks, mobile artillery platforms, and fortress-breaking siege drills were brought to the battlefield in an effort to shatter the defenders' entrenchments. The scale of mechanized warfare on Vraks was unprecedented, with armored columns advancing under constant artillery fire in battles that stretched for years. The deployment of specialized warfare units also left a lasting impression on the legacy of the siege. The attackers quickly realized that standard infantry tactics were insufficient, leading to the arrival of highly trained regiments that excelled in prolonged siege conditions. These forces were not just thrown into battle. They were adapted to a war where every step forward was paid for in blood. Similarly, the defenders recruited warriors who thrived in the brutal environment, ensuring that no ground was ever taken without a struggle. Another unique aspect of the siege was the psychological toll it took on those involved. The conditions on Vraks broke even the most hardened soldiers. Years of unrelenting combat, toxic environments, and the ever-present threat of enemy counterattacks created a battlefield where survival depended as much on mental endurance as physical capability. Many of those who fought on Vraks never returned to normal duty, their minds shattered by what they had witnessed. Ultimately, the siege of Vraks was not just another war in an unending cycle of galactic conflict. It was a brutal lesson in the cost of attrition, the dangers of prolonged engagements, and the extremes to which war can be pushed when neither side is willing to yield. The sheer scale of destruction, the tactics employed, and the psychological and environmental consequences make it a subject of endless discussion ensuring that its horrors will never be forgotten. Among the countless soldiers, commanders, and warlords who fought in the siege of Vraks, a few names stand out, figures who embodied the extremes of duty, fanaticism, and the brutal nature of war. Each of them played a role in shaping the outcome, whether through unyielding determination, tactical brilliance, or sheer force of will. Their strengths and flaws defined the battle, leaving behind legacies marked by both triumph and tragedy. The apostate cardinal, the man whose rebellion ignited the war, was a figure shrouded in both religious devotion and ruthless ambition. He was not a general by training, nor did he possess any particular military skill, yet his authority over Vraks was absolute. His power stemmed from his ability to inspire unwavering loyalty among his followers. To them, he was more than a leader. He was a prophet, a beacon of defiance against the imperium that had once given him its blessing. His greatest strength was his charisma, his ability to turn soldiers, clerics, and desperate souls into zealots willing to die for his cause. But this same devotion also blinded him to reality. He was no strategist, and as the war dragged on, his failure to adapt to its changing nature sealed his fate. His arrogance prevented him from seeing that the forces he had unleashed were beyond his control, and by the end, his rebellion had long ceased to be his own. On the opposite side of the conflict stood the generals of the Death Corps of Krieg, warriors molded by an existence of relentless warfare. Unlike their enemy, they were not driven by faith or personal ambition, but by duty alone. The commander of the campaign was a figure defined by unshakable discipline, a man who saw war not as an act of conquest, but as a necessary burden to be carried out without hesitation. He led with calculated precision, making decisions that prioritized efficiency over sentiment. His greatest strength lay in his ability to remain utterly detached from the horror of the siege. To him, every casualty was an acceptable loss, every hardship a necessary price for victory. Yet, this same quality made him incapable of understanding the deeper psychological toll of the war. His belief in relentless attrition prolonged the siege, as he refused to consider any strategy that deviated from the doctrine of grinding the enemy into submission. His greatest flaw was his inability to recognize that Vraks was not a conventional battlefield. It was a war that required more than just endurance. Among those who served under him, some stood out for their own unique approaches to the war. One of the most feared commanders was a siege specialist whose expertise lay in breaking fortified positions through sheer overwhelming firepower. He believed in the total annihilation of the enemy's defenses, leading devastating artillery campaigns that turned entire sectors into wastelands before his troops even advanced. His methods were brutally effective, but left nothing of value behind. His greatest strength was his ability to dismantle even the most entrenched enemy positions, but his reliance on mass destruction often caused unnecessary delays as his forces waited for bombardments to finish their work. On the other side, the defenders of Vraks included more than just desperate insurgents. Some among them were warriors with experience in prolonged conflicts, individuals who had fought in countless battles and saw the siege as another war to be won. A particular warlord, once a mercenary before pledging allegiance to the rebellion, became one of the most feared figures among the defenders. Unlike the cardinal, he had no illusions of divine purpose. He fought not for faith, but for the simple fact that he thrived in war. His skill in urban and trench warfare made him a constant thorn in the imperium's side, leading counteroffensives that inflicted severe losses, even in the face of overwhelming odds. His greatest strength was his adaptability. Where others saw only a losing battle, he found ways to turn the environment to his advantage. Yet, he was ultimately limited by the resources at his disposal. No amount of skill could compensate for the sheer weight of firepower the Imperium brought against him, and as the siege wore on, even he could not change the inevitable outcome. Other figures left their mark in different ways. A high-ranking officer within the Imperial Command became infamous for his ruthless suppression of any perceived weakness among his own troops. While his iron discipline ensured that morale did not collapse under the horrors of the siege, it also bred resentment among those under his command. His greatest strength was his unwavering belief in order, but his lack of empathy made him blind to the breaking points of his own soldiers. The siege of Vraks was not just a clash of armies, but of minds, personalities, and ideologies. Each of these figures played their part in a war that became larger than any of them, a conflict where individual strengths and weaknesses determined not just battles, but the fate of the planet itself. The siege of Vraks, despite its brutality and seemingly straightforward nature, remains a subject of debate among scholars, tacticians, and those who seek to understand its deeper implications. While the official records present a clear narrative of rebellion, siege, and eventual victory, there are many unanswered questions and theories surrounding the conflict, details that do not quite add up, inconsistencies that hint at a hidden side of the war. Some of these mysteries have been studied in depth, while others remain obscured beneath the ruins of Vraks itself. One of the most persistent questions is how the defenders of Vraks managed to hold out for so long. Official accounts suggest that they were well stocked due to the planet's nature as a munitions world, but this explanation does not fully account for the sheer endurance of their resistance. The war dragged on for far longer than initial Imperial projections had estimated, with the defenders able to continuously field fresh troops and supplies despite the blockade and relentless assaults. Some theories suggest that external forces may have provided assistance, either covertly or through means unknown to Imperial strategists. The presence of certain war bands in the later stages of the siege has led some to speculate that outside intervention played a larger role than officially acknowledged. Another point of contention revolves around the level of corruption within the ranks of the defenders. The rebellion began under the leadership of a single figure, but over the years the war transformed into something far darker. The change was gradual, but by the end of the siege, the defenders had shifted from conventional resistance to something more akin to a force entirely consumed by the war itself. This has led to speculation about the true nature of the rebellion. Was it always destined to spiral into something far more dangerous? Or did the prolonged exposure to the horrors of war alter the defenders into something unrecognizable? The question of whether there were deeper, more insidious influences at work remains a topic of debate. Another mystery surrounds the sheer scale of the losses suffered during the war. The numbers reported by Imperial authorities suggest an astronomical cost in lives, with entire regiments wiped out and casualty figures reaching levels rarely seen outside of the most devastating conflicts. Yet, some analysts argue that even these staggering numbers may be underreported. There are accounts from survivors that describe entire divisions vanishing overnight, records of battalions that were never accounted for after key battles, and reports of engagements that do not appear in official archives. Whether these losses were the result of battlefield miscalculations, command failures, or something else entirely remains unknown. One of the more controversial theories involves the aftermath of the siege. While the Imperium officially declared Vraks a victory, the world itself was left abandoned, its surface rendered uninhabitable by the war. The question remains, why was the planet not re-established as a functional Imperial outpost? Given its strategic importance as a munitions world, it would have been expected that efforts would be made to restore its facilities, yet no such attempts were ever undertaken. Some believe that something was left behind on Vraks, something that made continued occupation impossible. Whether this was due to lingering contamination, unseen threats, or knowledge that the Imperium deemed best left buried is still debated. Additionally, there are inconsistencies regarding the final days of the siege. While the major battles and turning points of the war are well documented, there are gaps in the official timeline. Reports from the front lines during the closing stages of the war mention strange phenomena, soldiers describing events that defied explanation, and entire sectors of the battlefield being wiped from record. What exactly transpired in those last months remains uncertain, but the fact that entire units were seemingly removed from the official history suggests that there is more to the story than what has been made public. Perhaps the most unsettling mystery is the fate of certain key individuals involved in the conflict. While some of the war's major figures met well-documented ends, others simply disappeared. There are records of commanders whose last known locations do not align with battlefield reports, suggesting that some may have escaped rather than perished. If any of the rebellion's leaders survived, their whereabouts remain unknown. The possibility that remnants of Vraks' defenders could still exist in the shadows, biding their time, is a concern that lingers to this day. The Siege of Vraks is remembered as one of the deadliest conflicts in recorded history, but beyond the official narrative, questions remain unanswered. What truly sustained the defenders? What horrors unfolded in the final days? What knowledge was deemed too dangerous to preserve? The war may be over, but its mysteries continue to haunt those who seek to understand the full scope of what transpired. The legacy of the Siege of Vraks extends far beyond the destruction of a single world. While the war itself ended in a brutal victory for the Imperium, its consequences continue to ripple through the galaxy, shaping military doctrine, political policies, and even the psychological resilience of those who fight in the Imperium's endless wars. The siege was not just a battle. It was a lesson, a warning, and a grim reminder of what happens when conflicts spiral beyond control. One of the most immediate and long-lasting effects was the shift in Imperial siege warfare doctrine. The failure to achieve a swift victory on Vraks exposed the weaknesses of prolonged attrition campaigns. The Imperium had underestimated the resilience of a determined enemy, and as a result, new strategies were implemented to avoid repeating the same mistakes. Future conflicts saw the increased use of overwhelming force in the earliest stages of war, with high command favoring swift, brutal strikes to eliminate the potential for prolonged engagements. The days of slow trench warfare, once a hallmark of certain campaigns, were largely abandoned in favor of massive, concentrated offensives meant to crush opposition before it could fully entrench itself. Another major consequence was the psychological toll on Imperial forces. The sheer scale of suffering on Vraks left a lasting impact on those who survived. Many of the soldiers who fought in the siege found themselves incapable of returning to standard regiments. The conditions they had endured, years of unrelenting bombardment, exposure to chemical warfare, and the horrors of trench combat, had fundamentally changed them. As a result, certain units, particularly those of the Death Corps of Krieg, became even more isolated from other Imperial forces. Their already extreme doctrines of self-sacrifice and relentless advance were reinforced by what they had experienced on Vraks, making them even less reliant on traditional human instincts such as self-preservation. This divide only grew over time, leading to the perception that these regiments were no longer merely soldiers, but something beyond human in their willingness to fight and die without hesitation. The devastation of Vraks itself had long-term implications for the Imperium's logistical network. The loss of a world so rich in munitions and war material forced a restructuring of supply chains across multiple sectors. Other planets were pressured to increase production to compensate for what had been lost, but the gap left by Vraks was never fully recovered. In the grand scale of the Imperium's endless wars, this disruption may have seemed insignificant, yet every war machine that went without ammunition, every regiment that lacked proper equipment, could trace part of its struggles back to the destruction of Vraks. Beyond the Imperium, the siege served as a symbol to those who would consider rebellion. It was a demonstration of the Imperium's willingness to wage total war, to commit limitless resources and lives to the suppression of defiance. However, while it acted as a deterrent in some cases, it also provided a blueprint for resistance. Other warlords and insurgent leaders studied the defense of Vraks, analyzing how a single fortified world had held out against the full might of the Imperium for so long. While the rebellion was ultimately crushed, it had proven that even the largest military force in the galaxy could be slowed, worn down, and bled dry. Future uprisings took lessons from Vraks, learning to use prolonged sieges and trench warfare to their advantage. In this way, the Imperium's brutal victory may have inadvertently planted the seeds for future conflicts that could be just as devastating. The implications of what transpired on Vraks also extended into darker territories. Certain reports from the final stages of the siege were never made public, their details sealed away by authorities who deemed them too dangerous to reveal. What exactly had transpired in the last days of the war remained a mystery, but whispers persisted of horrors that could not be explained by conventional means. Whether these were exaggerations from war-weary soldiers or evidence of something far worse remains uncertain, but the secrecy surrounding those final months suggests that the Imperium did not leave Vraks unscathed. Some have theorized that the war uncovered something best left buried, something that even the victors feared. Whatever the truth may be, Vraks was never resettled, and its ruins remain a silent monument to the cost of war. In the long run, the siege of Vraks proved that even in an age defined by endless conflict, there are battles so costly that victory feels indistinguishable from defeat. It was a war that reshaped imperial military thinking, altered the psyche of those who fought in it, and left a scar on the Imperium's ability to wage war elsewhere. While history records it as a triumph, those who truly understand what happened know that the price paid on Vraks was one that the Imperium will continue to feel for centuries to come.